All right, hello everyone. Today I am here to talk about one of my all-time favorite fantasy authors. If not, in my opinion, one of the greatest fantasy authors of our time, and that is, of course, the Queen of Fantasy herself, T. Kingfisher. T. Kingfisher is, of course, the a pen name for Ursula Vernon, who is just a super prolific fantasy and horror author. Today, I'm only going to be talking about her fantasy novels, mostly because I haven't read any of her horror novels yet. And she is ridiculously prolific. I've been putting off this video for a long time, trying to make sure I get all of her books read. And she has two more books coming out, like one later this year, and I think the other one I think is coming out later this year, but it might be early next year. So like I've been debating whether I should do this video because it's going to very quickly become obsolete as I introduce all of her books. But she's so prolific, I have to start somewhere. And so as of June 2026, these are all the books all of the fantasy novels she has out, and these are going to be my quick reviews of all of them, along with recommendations of where to start. If you haven't read any T. Kingfisher, where's the best place to start her bibliography? I'll give those recommendations as we go. But first off, quickly introduce myself for those who are new here. I'm A.C. Wilson, fantasy author of the Gwampi Tetralogy. I have two of the books back here, My Father's Ghost, My Father's God. Book one is My Father's Land, and I sold that copy, so that's why I don't have it behind me. But it'll be in a future video, I'm sure. But you can check out, I'll leave links in the video description. You can check out my links, check out my books. If you subscribe to my email list, you get a free copy of my standalone novel, Flashes of Fire. So that way you can, for free, get to check out my writing and see if you like the world I'm building and you like my vibes. Otherwise, if you're just here for book reviews, thanks for coming in, and let's get into it. Let's talk about Ursula Vernon or T. Kingfisher. And I should address that right up. Ursula Vernon has other books that she has published under her actual name, Ursula Vernon. My understanding is they are all middle grade, which I have read some of the T. Kingfisher middle grade, and it's phenomenal stuff. Like, as an adult, I still really enjoyed the books. So I'm sure her middle grade fantasy under the name Ursula Vernon is also amazing. I had to put a limit on the number of books I was going to cover in a single video, and already I'm stretching how many books I can cover in this thing. I'm going to try to keep it under 30 minutes. We'll see if I can do that. So this is only the books that are by T. Kingfisher, not the books labeled with Ursula Vernon's name. As far as like what to expect when you pick up a T. Kingfisher book, just broadly across all of her books. One of the things I really love about T. Kingfisher's books is that they all tend to be centered in a more mundane and like the settings tend to be those of average people, and less about big dramatic political events where the kings and the wizards are the main characters. Instead, you have craftspeople, you have regular villagers. Those are the sort of people who tend to be populating T. Kingfisher's books. So another thing that means is that T. Kingfisher's works tend to be pulling a lot more on the fairy tale side of fantasy and less on the big dramatic epic side of fantasy. So if that's the sort of stories you're a fan of, you're really going to love T. Kingfisher. Even if you prefer the big epic stories, you definitely still need to give T. Kingfisher a try. I think, like I said, I think she is a fantasy author of a generation, and she is just phenomenal at what she does. Honestly, I would compare her very favorably to Neil Gaiman as far as her writing style goes. And the plus is when you read T. Kingfisher, you don't have to feel guilty about it, as opposed to when you read Neil Gaiman. But as far as just like the really well-written prose, the really fun, quirky world building that like pulls a lot on fairy tales, can sometimes border on body horror at points, but really centers on these very human stories and the heroism of ordinary people. And that's really a theme that T. Kingfisher comes back to again and again, is ordinary people who are heroes in ways that like the lords can never be. If that makes sense. Anyway, so let's get into like what are T. Kingfisher's books. So we'll start off. She has 3 middle grade books that she has published under the T. Kingfisher title. Again, as Ursula Vernon. I think she has several more. I'm just not familiar with them. I haven't read them. So, starting off with the one I do have a hard copy of, and that is A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher. This is a phenomenal place to start with T. Kingfisher. If you want to give her a try, this is a great book to start. You'll get her sense of how she writes characters, her approach to characters, where she tends to have where like the protagonist of this book is a baker's apprentice, and everything about this character fits into the fact that she is a baker's apprentice. Her magic revolves around baking, and it is phenomenal how she builds the story out from this really mundane setting of being a baker's apprentice. It's kind of a classic example of how T. Kingfisher approaches stories. And I love it so much. This book is phenomenal. Like, not only is it just a rollicking good tale, but the end of the book has a really impactful punch to it, as far as very thought-provoking. You realize she's doing something subtly here, where she's commenting on society and heroes and the pressures we put on people to be heroes, and the pressures we put on children specifically. Like, you don't think you're getting a really intellectual book, but this is what T. Kingfisher does phenomenally. She sneaks in these really thought-provoking themes behind just a rollicking good story. And so I can't praise this book enough. This is one of her best books in my opinion. It is middle grade too, which turns away some people, but also means, like, I'll be giving this to my kids in a couple years once they're old enough to start reading these books, because this is just that good of a book. So highly recommend this one, honestly, for adults or kids. It's one of T. Kingfisher's best, and so yeah, that's the first of her middle grade books. It's the one I have a physical copy of because I love it that much. I do most of my books audio, and while I was preparing for this video, I realized I have so few of T. Kingfisher's book in physical form, which is a crime. I need to get more of her books in physical form. So, moving on then, next one in the middle grade category is Illuminations. This book looks at a family of magical illuminators. And it's in a setting that's vaguely reminiscent of, like, an Italian city-states. In fact, I'm pretty sure the setting for this book, and T. Kingfisher does this a lot, where she will have sneakily this really profound setting that's just so well layered in the background, you don't even realize what's going on until, like, halfway through. And so Illuminations, the setting appears to be a alternative history Europe, where the reforms of the French Revolution caught on across all of Europe. So there's just, like, these subtle things that they take for granted about the world. Like, for instance, the whole events of the story take place in the month of Thermidor, which is just, it's so subtle. It's in the background. It doesn't really impact a lot of the story, but it's just so amazing. I love how she pulls these really, really deep but subtle references to other things. Anyway, I will digress. Illuminations is another great one. It's middle grade. And as an adult, I still really appreciated it, but it deals with this young girl who's trying to fit in with the rest of her family, kind of a quirky family, a little bit like a Roald Dahl book with kind of the quirky families trying to get along and deal with this magical problem they're having. It's a delightful book. Highly recommend that one too. And then the last of the middle grade books by T. Kingfisher is Minor Mage. This one looks at a young boy whose village is suffering from drought, and with his armadillo familiar, he sets out to bring the rain back to his village. And it's kind of a classic Golden Fleece sort of a story, where he has to go through several different adventures to finally reach the mountains where the sky herders live, to bring back the clouds and bring rain to his village. It's a delightful... I don't think it's one of Kingfisher's strongest books. It suffers the problem of a lot of Golden Fleece stories, in my opinion, where each of the events of each of the adventures doesn't really build well off of itself. But it's still a delightful book. Especially for middle grade readers, you're really going to get a lot out of Minor Mage, and it is delightful. Just the relationship between the protagonist and his armadillo familiar is hysterical. It's delightful. So moving on to the other books by T. Kingfisher, those that are geared more towards adults. her T. Kingfisher's fantasy can broadly be divided into two categories. You have all of her books in the world of the White Rat, which is a extensive fantasy world she's working on. Her next book is in this world, so it's still ongoing. Um, and then you have her standalone fantasy novels. So I'll start by talking about her standalone fantasy novels. Starting off with, I think, two of the best places to start reading T. Kingfisher if you're unfamiliar with her. And one I have a physical copy of. Actually, I have physical copies of both, but I have loaned out one. So one I have right now, and that is Snake Eater. Snake Eater is T. Kingfisher's most recent book, and this one blew my socks off. Like, as soon as it came out, I bought a copy and read it because I know I was going to love it because I love everything T. Kingfisher writes. But I was blown away by this one. This might be one of my favorites that she's written. Like most of T. Kingfisher's books, it looks at a middle-aged protagonist, or I suppose the protagonist in this book is more of like someone who's suffering under a first quarter life crisis, which, as someone who's gone through a first quarter life crisis, I really sympathized with the protagonist in this book. This also, I think, really had an excellent look at faith. As a person of faith myself, I really love seeing characters of faith portrayed in literature and books. And though I don't think it's something T. Kingfisher really sets out to do, her portrayal of religion and faith I find really heartwarming in these books. And Snake Eater is probably the best example of a book where kind of the religious messaging really creeps up on you. You're not expecting it, but the moments where she talks about faith and is really profound, and I love it. I love it. I don't know if that's what most readers would take away from Snake Eater, but that was what I took away, was a lot of just like the profound discussions of religion and how that impacts your day-to-day life. Snake Eater is a little bit different from a lot of T. Kingfisher books, though, because it is set in a near future setting. It's a little bit hope punk setting, and it is set in the southwestern deserts of America. So I don't know if it's specifically Arizona or if that's just Arizona vibes, but think Arizona as this woman is kind of crashing out after working herself half to death in the big city and getting out of an abusive relationship, goes to her great aunt's house in the southwestern deserts of Arizona and accidentally attracts the interest of an ancient roadrunner god. It's phenomenal. I loved it. And again, an excellent place to start T. Kingfisher is Snake Eater. The other excellent place to start T. Kingfisher, and this is where I started T. Kingfisher personally, is Nettle and Bone. This is probably the most reminiscent of a Neil Gaiman book of T. Kingfisher's writing. And again, I mean this in the best possible way because, like, I liked Neil Gaiman a lot, and I'm heartbroken over everything about that, and that is why I love recommending T. Kingfisher, because I feel like this is the best of what Neil Gaiman was without having all of the guilt. Nettle and Bone feels like it is a classic fairy tale of a disenfranchised princess who's going to help out her older sister, and has to assemble this kind of rogues gallery of misfits and wannabe fairy godmothers to try to help out her sister and save her from an awful marriage, political marriage. And it's delightful. And again, like everything else T. Kingfisher writes, not only is it just a fun and heartwarming story, but there's also just a lot of really thought-provoking discussion of myth and fairy tale. And yeah, it's delightful. It's delightful. So that's it. That's one of my all-time favorites by T. Kingfisher, and is a great place to be introduced to her writing style. Moving on, we have Hemlock and Silver. This is another phenomenal T. Kingfisher book. It's not quite my favorite, but it's phenomenal. It's amazing. This also introduces another subset of T. Kingfisher books, which is fairy tale retellings. Hemlock and Silver is specifically a retelling of Snow White. I say that, however, it's completely unlike any version of Snow White you have ever heard. For example, the protagonist is herself a middle-aged expert in poisons. And so the whole story is from her perspective. Snow White is not the protagonist. There's a cute romance subplot in the story, and otherwise it is just a delightful and really unconventional retelling of Snow White. I'm always a little bit nervous of reading reading fairy tale retellings, but T. Kingfisher consistently does interesting things and fascinating things, takes these in wildly different directions than you would ever expect. So Hemlock and Silver is also a phenomenal book. It would be a great place to start T. Kingfisher if you wanted to. Then we have A Sorceress Comes to Call. This one is also just a great T. Kingfisher book. It is a little bit more on the horror side than a lot of these other fantasy books, but I thought it was delightful. The protagonist in this one is the daughter of a sorceress, and you're definitely getting like religious trauma survivor vibes from this book, as the daughter is wrestling with her mother who uses sorcery on her to make her to be this role model child. And so it's, especially if you have any kind of triggers around child abuse, this book might be a good one to pass on. But it's a phenomenally written book. It's really satisfying. And I highly recommend this one. As you can probably tell already, I'm going to be highly recommending like everything Kingfisher writes. So take that for what it's worth. Huge fan of T. Kingfisher. And then moving on to Seventh Bride. This one is also so fun and delightful. It might be another fairy tale retelling, and I'm just not familiar with the original fairy tale. It feels very much like a fairy tale, though, where this 16-year-old miller's daughter gets forced into an arranged marriage with this local noble who drags her back to his magically enchanted house. And there she discovers that she is literally the seventh woman he has married, and she now has to like get along with his other wives and figure out what in the world is going on. Delightful. I loved it. Again, you could start T. Kingfisher with any of these books. This would be a fun one to start with. It's a little bit not her typical thing in that the protagonist is a teenager, and most of her protagonists tend to be middle-aged women. Still, I love this book so much. And with that, we move on to T. Kingfisher's shorter books, her novellas. And so we'll start off with Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher. This is also a fun book. This one is kind of a retelling of Sleeping Beauty. And what I loved about this one is, so first off, the protagonist is the fairy who put the spell on Sleeping Beauty to make her sleep. She is the protagonist of the story. And so you're seeing this story from a completely different angle than before. And then the other thing I loved about this book is that the knight who's moving in is a Turkish knight who is Muslim. And so you get this alternative perspective on chivalry, which of course Muslim chivalry and Christian chivalry existed in the same universe and had a significant amount of overlap. If you're at all familiar with any of the stories around like King Richard the Lionheart and Saladin and their kind of bromance, as these two different versions of chivalry that are largely similar, how they're interacting with each other. That's the vibe I got from this book. Is T. Kingfisher's looking at chivalry through a different light on purpose, so that you can kind of get a different look at it. And I found this really fascinating and so much fun. So much fun. My only complaint about this book was that it was so short. I would have read a 400-page book of this novella, and instead it's a novella. It's great. It's awesome. And that's really a complaint I have of all of T. Kingfisher's novella is they're all delightful, and I wish they were all longer. So moving on to her most recent novella, and that is Nine Goblins. This one is just so delightful. And again, in typical T. Kingfisher style, she's smuggling in really thought-provoking themes of the cost of war. This book is anti-war in its deepest sense, but really it's just about 9 goblins just like misbehaving and causing mayhem and trying to get back to their own lines in the middle of this horrific war. And it's delightful. And I, as a father who has to deal with children, I felt for this poor goblin sergeant having to deal with these unruly goblins who are basically toddlers. This is possibly T. Kingfisher's funniest book. And again, my only complaint is, why couldn't this be a full novel? Please, I need a full novel of these goblin wars, because this is hysterical. And now, moving on to The Raven and the Reindeer. This one is so much fun. It's one of her earliest books, and I didn't hear a lot of people talking about it, but it is delightful. It is definitely inspired by Norwegian or Swedish folk stories. And kind of the premise is that the protagonist, has this crush on this village boy, and then one day the village boy gets kidnapped by the Winter Queen in her sleigh that's literally pulled by flying talking otters, which is just the most amazing piece of world building ever. Like, I already was in love with your writing, T. Kingfisher. Why did you have to make me love you so much more? Because you included flying talking otters? I love this. Again with this book. This book just seems like it's a rollicking, exciting adventure, and instead becomes this really thought-provoking discussion of sexual identity. And again, you do not see that coming from the premise of this book, and that is what I love about T. Kingfisher. She's not only going to tell you a phenomenally good yarn, she's also going to be leaving you with these fascinating topics and thought-provoking concepts that are just going to stick with you. Like, this book in particular has stuck with me more than any of the others just because of how she addresses sexual identity. And how the metaphor she uses in this book is so powerful. So, moving on then to the last of these shorter novels or novellas, and that is Bryony and Roses. This one is also really delightful. It's not my favorite of hers, but this is her retelling of Beauty and the Beast. And again, she takes it in such a fun new direction that is not what you expect from the premise of a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. Typical T. Kingfisher stuff. I loved it. This is not probably the one I would recommend not starting with, just because I don't think it's her strongest work. And if you want to get a good introduction to T. Kingfisher, you want to start with one of her stronger books, like Snake Eater or Nettle and Bones. So with that, I can move on to T. Kingfisher's World of the White Rat series. And this is 3 different sub-series within this world that she's building. And that's the Clock Tower War series, the Sword Heart series, and then the Saint of Steel series. That's chronological order, but I actually would recommend reading this out of chronological order. So I would recommend starting with the Saint of Steel series. You get a great introduction to the world this way. And this is, I think, the strongest sub-series in the series. And not only that, I think these are some of T. Kingfisher's best books, period. These are the books that got me into reading romance. I started reading the Saint of Steel series, and I was like, oh, this is a spicy romance book. I did not realize that was what I was getting myself into. And then by halfway through the book, I was like, oh, this is why people like spicy romance books. Because I had been turned off because of like the weird tropes in the romance community. And T. Kingfisher just so flawlessly executes romance. Even her spicy scenes, like, I feel like too often authors just have spicy scenes because you're supposed to have a spicy scene, or just to be gratuitous sometimes. I think that's less often than people like to pretend. But T. Kingfisher, all of her spicy scenes are earned. And I really respect that and appreciate that. And she's helped me understand how I actually view spice in fantasy by reading how she does it, because she always executes it flawlessly. So thank you, Ursula Vernon, for converting me and making me see the error of my ways. And I now understand. So that caveat aside, so if you have a huge objection to spicy romance, don't read The Saint of Steel, or any of the books in the World of the White Rat, because all of them have a certain level of spice to them, for sure. They're not like the most spicy books out there, but they've got sex scenes in them. So The Saint of Steel is going to be a 7-book series. It is projected to be a 7-book series. And currently we only have 4 in that series. And that is the Paladin's Grace, Paladin's Strength, Paladin's Hope, and then finally Paladin's Faith. So the next 3 books in the series, I eagerly await. So the basic premise of this whole series is that this group of paladins who's like adheres to this patron saint, and the patron saint like guides them through this like religious, ecstatic, berserk state they go through to like rid the world of injustice, and the saint dies somehow and leaves this group of paladins devastated. Many of them go insane. Most of the order dies, so that only 7 people survive who were paladins of the Saint of Steel, and they are shells of themselves and trying to recover. Not only are these just top tier romance books, the world building is also top tier. The reflections on faith are spectacular. Again, I don't think T. Kingfisher. I don't know. She talks about faith enough that she probably is a person of faith in some way. I don't know what her personal faith is, but it is so compelling how she talks about faith and religion, and the interplay between personal faith and organized religion, is so fascinating and so well done. For books that are otherwise very popular feeling and very adventure themed, like, they are so thought provoking. So that's the Saint of Steel series. Each book follows a different paladin through their romance and their journey of healing after this traumatic event that shakes their faith. And then the broader series is delving into what actually happened that led to the death of the Saint of Steel. And there seems to be some kind of broader conspiracy going on between the saints and the gods. Really excited to see where the series goes because I am really invested in that series. So then moving back chronologically to the Swordheart series occurs like maybe a decade before the Saint of Steel series. It is loosely connected. The main connection is the Temple of the White Rat, which is a religious order that exists between these two series. So Swordheart is currently the only book out in this series, but the second book, Daggerheart, is coming out later this year, and I've literally just yesterday was approved to receive an ARC for that book. So I am so excited to read Daggerbound, the second book in this series. But Swordheart, the protagonist, is being pressured into a arranged marriage with her cousin so that her aunt's family can take all of her husband's wealth, and in a fit of desperation finds this old sword and draws it, only to discover that there is a barbarian whose soul is bound to the sword, and he becomes her defender. And obviously then there's a romance between the two. It's delightful. We love it. I did have a quibble with how the third act of this book resolved itself. But otherwise, this is such a fun book. And especially after you have read The Saint of Steel, you definitely need to check out Swordheart. It's phenomenal, and I have high hopes for Daggerbound. And this series has the potential to be just so good, so good. Again, it's peak romance, and just the relationship and the banter between the protagonist and this spirit of this barbarian who is bound to the sword. The banter between these two is top tier. We love this stuff. So that is Swordheart, the Swordheart series. Highly recommend it. And then finally, moving on to the last of the T. Kingfisher series, and that is the Clock Tower Wars. This starts with Clockwork Boys, and then the sequel is The Wonder Engines. These books really could be a single book. And honestly, these two books, I think, are T. Kingfisher's weakest books, period. Which is the main reason I don't recommend reading the Book of the White Rat in chronological order, because this would be the first book you read, and this would just be a shame if this is what your first impression of the world of the White Rat is. So it's a fun D&D style adventure with the main energy of the story is a romance. And it's fun for what it is. But it's not T. Kingfisher's strongest. So this is a series that, if you have read a lot of T. Kingfisher, definitely give this book a read. If you've never read any of T. Kingfisher's books, wait a bit, because there's so many better books to read first before you get here. Especially if you're really invested in the world of the White Rat, like I am, you definitely need to read this. This occurs like several hundred years beforehand, and so it's some great backstory to the world building that then you see in the Saint of Steel series or the Swordheart series. But otherwise, again, it's one of T. Kingfisher's weaker books, so I'd say wait on this one until you have read a lot more of T. Kingfisher's books. So that is it. That is my mega review of all of T. Kingfisher's fantasy novels. Again, I haven't even touched her fantasy novel, her horror novels. That'll have to be another video. This woman is insanely prolific, and we love it. Please, Ursula Vernon, continue to write all of these books. I will be here to read and devour them. I'm probably going to have to do a addendum to this video when Daggerbound comes out. because I'm sure I'm going to have thoughts on that book. It might just be a short, so keep your eye out on my feed to check out my short review of Daggerbound when I'm sure that will come out. But otherwise, let me know. Have you read any T. Kingfisher? What do you think of her? What are your favorite books by her? And especially if you've read some of her horror, because again, I haven't touched any of that. So if you have recommendations on any of her horror novels, definitely send those recommendations my way. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments, answer any of your questions in the comments. But until next time, this has been me, and happy reading, y'all.